Performance managers, risk and opportunity management is the topic of this teaching video. Risk management is something that most of the people tend to neglect, but it is a fascinating topic. And if you look at the opportunities in every critical situation, you will find out that this will be the key moment of changing your company and developing your business. The learning objectives for this module are: first, understand the concept of risk and opportunity management. Second, comprehend the details of the risk management framework I'm going to present. Third, apply the logic of internal controls to business realities. And fourth, understand the very important behavioral risk aspects of risk management. Crisis in Chinese means threat and opportunity at the same time. So be prepared for the worst to make the best out of any situation. My definition of risk and opportunity management goes as follows. Risk and opportunity management is a systematic process of identifying, assessing, monitoring, and consciously dealing with uncertain events and situations which might harm or benefit an organization and have the potential to prevent it from or facilitating achieving its objectives. You see, they're the two parts of it. Uncertain event might harm an organization or they might benefit an organization. In any case, it's important to be prepared. Let me stress one point of my definition, the systematic process. It is important to bring risk management to the hearts, to the processes and the culture of an organization, and prepare it for uncertain events. This is the dark side of performance management in a world of uncertainty. If you're prepared, even a crisis might be an opportunity for you. A risk management framework can be quite square, but the interesting thing is that it will give you more access to details. So I will concentrate on four aspects of risk management. First, the risk culture. The risk culture contains the topics like risk awareness, risk appetite, risk environment, and risk procedures. The risk cultures is the beginning of a successful risk management. And even here, let me also look at the opportunities at hand and how can we cultivate a company that's actively seizing opportunities and thriving on uncertain situations. Second, risk assessment. When we talk about risk assessment, it's about the identification of things that might go wrong or that might change in such a way that for the well-prepared, it opens up opportunities. Here we have to talk about risk likelihood, risk impact, and what can we do to control the situation. Talking about control, we also talk about how to handle the situation. How to maybe reject certain aspects of business that are so heavily infected by uncertainty that we don't want to go there because the impact of an uncertain event might be too drastic for us to handle. We might transfer risks. That means we might eventually ask insurances to take part of the risk. We might actively control processes and make sure that we are dealing with the situation so that we can safely control it. Or we accept risks and just see that as a natural thing to do. Risk governance means that we have to take into account that people want to be informed, that communication of risk is a very important aspect of management. Here we also talk about internal auditing. Internal auditing can be a chance not only to bring risk management into the organization, but also to make sure that it's really there. Governance is the management of management. Therefore, we also have to define a risk strategy, maybe even a risk culture or risk reporting. Risk reporting has become a legal obligation for most companies. Therefore, yes, of course, it is part of our framework. No risk, no fun. No risk, no gain. So what is your risk appetite as an individual organization? Are you a risk seeker or is your risk aversion dominant? Some companies, young companies, have nothing to lose, so they are actively seeking for risks. This is also natural in a capitalistic system where you want to develop with innovation new situations that are good for you. The older you grow as an organization, you'll find out that you start having something to lose, and that risk awareness is important. Risk awareness is the awareness that yes, there are things that could go wrong, and you have to take an active approach to dealing with that. This risk awareness is the first step in an increased maturity of your risk culture. Of course, you might end up with risk procedures everywhere, so that risk procedures are part of every domain of your company, part of every process. That can be from hiring new people to the sales process. And in all these processes, we have areas where risks are to be dealt with. And finally, there's a risk environment. The risk environment is a mixture of structure and attitude. And we will talk about structure in more detail further on. Structures of companies are legal requirements. Well, if you look at, for example, German Aktiengesellschaften, you'll see they all have a supervisory board and an executive board. The supervisory board is asking questions about the governance of risk. The risk governance. Is the executive board dealing with risk management effectively? Do they have a chief risk officer? Banks need to have a chief risk officer, but in most boards you'll find somebody who at least has the job as chief risk officer. Some companies also have a chief technical risk officer or a chief financial risk officer or commercial risk officer. The executive boards then trigger down these responsibilities to risk managers along the line, the divisions, the regions, and the units. So this corporate risk structure is not anything that is done because we just want it. It is a legal requirement in most legislations. So it's not something that is an add-on or something that can be done. External auditors will test it, and your survival as a company not only depends on an effective risk management. Also, formally, you have to make sure that your risk management is working. The external auditors will test that. Your internal auditors might eventually help the company and organization to test it as well, and serve as an educational program as well. Both the external auditors and internal audit report to the executive board and the supervisory board. There's another job that was developed over the last decades, the chief compliance officer. The job is to deal with compliance with laws and regulations. Here we especially have topics like money laundering or corruption that these people have to deal with. That adds an additional layer of control to the management of risks in our business. The effectiveness of risk cultures is difficult to analyze. However, there are a few questions that might help you on your own understanding. So, are there topics in your company or organization that are shunned and never talked about? Taboos of potential risks? Do you have a chief risk officer or designated risk managers with access to top management? Do you have written risk procedures? Or do you eventually even engage in businesses which might put the existence of the company at risk? And what happens to people who address risks? Are they marginalized? That means, okay, you've been very critical in this last meeting, so we decided not to have you on the next meeting about this topic. This is happening all the way because we don't want to hear about risks. We don't want to get away from our root of optimism. Therefore, we have to actively deal with that, even against the natural tendencies of human beings. So let's talk about risk and opportunity assessments. First of all, we have to identify risks. And when I talk about risk, also think about opportunities, because every risk bears its opportunity in itself. The risk identification answers the question, what could go wrong? The assessment means how likely is that potential event, and what would be the impact if that risk materializes? And what is the level of control we can exercise over this event? In some cases it's low, and in some cases we have a lot of control on certain risks. So where do we have to look at if we want to identify our risks? There are basically three different perspectives here: the operational risks, the strategic risks, and the external risks. Let's start with the operational risks. They stem from the operational business processes. So we are a production company, and a production company has the problems that there are certain risks in the production, in selling things, in acquiring things. That's very normal. Negligence, accidents, errors, and fraud might be the key drivers of operational risks. We're just not up to our tasks. And the good news is most of the operational risks can be mitigated, maybe not fully controlled, but mitigated by internal controls. If we look at the strategic risks, they stem from the business model transformation or degradation. That means either we are changing our business model, and yes, it might evolve well or not so well, or we're not doing anything. That means in this case, our business model will degrade naturally because our competitors are addressing our markets. That can be R&D, it can be M&A topics or other investment failures. Most of these strategic risks are inevitable, and we are set in a certain kind of dilemma. If we don't do anything, our business model will degrade. If we do something, there are risks involved. So these are topics that we have to carefully manage and contain risks, but there will always be risks left. And last, we have external risks. The external risks are out of our company's control. These can be political, economic, technological, or natural changes. The coronavirus epidemic is probably one good example of an external risks. What can we do here? We can monitor, ensure, and protect. The world of risks is frightful, but let's go through it step by step and prepare for the situations. Let's have a look at the external risks. That can be quite overwhelming. Let's start with ecological risks. Climate change, the erosion of grounds, the lack of water, but all of that will have an impact on us. Maybe the car industry is a good example for how to deal with a change in ecological consciousness of a society. Talking about societal or social risks, we see demographical developments. We see aging of our societies. We see the problems of recruiting the right candidates for our companies. We see that we have a lot of elder people that are difficult to substitute by newer people. Competition. Yes, new competitors may come, and these competitors might evolve from our own country, or they can come from China or somewhere else. The competitive landscape is voluntarily set in a way that we have to count with surprises. Economical risks mean that we have overall a decline in the activities of businesses. This will have an impact on us. Our sales will go down if overall sales go down. If we have a pandemic situation like with the coronavirus, the economic impact is huge for everyone. Political risks evolve over the time, so especially geopolitical risks are now the norm, with the US under Trump questioning the whole international system, international trade, and the question of whether we can we can deal with all our international partners are a point. But political questions might also be whether a certain country is still stable and is accepted in the international community. And last but not least, there are technological changes, technological risks. If a new technology arises, it might pose challenges for existing business models. We've seen that with the digitalization and the internet that has dramatically shifted the way people can address direct customers and have put into question the business models of retailing and other areas of our economy. External risks are there to be monitored, and they are a good opportunity to look at new ways to address them. External risks are also external opportunities. The likelihood of certain events is difficult to measure. In most of the cases, it's completely impossible to come up with good numbers. We saw that in the coronavirus pandemic, that there are a lot of numbers, but nobody can trust them. So likelihood is something that is more of a subjective tâtonnement versus an assessment of the situation. If we say low, moderate, high, or very high, these are subjective measures. If we had a situation where we can look through the veil of uncertainty, we might have probabilities, but we don't get there. So let's talk about likelihoods. That could be, so the risk likelihood, for example, of a natural disaster like an earthquake in an area that has never encountered earthquakes might be quite low. And the destruction of our production site might be low as well. However, if we put a nuclear power plant in an area where earthquakes and tsunamis are quite natural to happen, then we probably have a risk likelihood that's much higher, eventually very high. The question is whether that's acceptable or not. Depends on the impact. So some things are quite likely, for example, the misappropriation of company assets by employees. This is happening all the time. And risks like accounts receivables are not collectible because our customers go bankrupt is something we have to deal with every day. Risk likelihood assessment is important because if we have the risk likelihood and the risk impact that we'll talk about now, we can see how important a certain risk for us is and whether we have to deal with it actively. Impact assessment is dealing with the question, how bad would it be if some event finally occurs? So would it be disastrous for us, or would that just be a minor impact? So if we, for example, have an accident in the production with a few casualties, is that minor impact? For a small company, that might be already disastrous. But if we have 100,000 people working in production, this might just be a minor impact. It all depends on the company and the impact for the company. A modest risk impact might be an accident that leads to leakage of toxic matters into the river for your production company dealing with toxic matters. This has probably an impact on our balance sheet, on our income statement, and might have bad regional coverage in the press. Most of our impact could have an impact on our reputation as a company, and reputational risks are very crucial in today's world. The national recall of a product might already be severe. If we have to recall all of our cars because something is dangerous, maybe the brakes are not working, this is probably not only from a financial perspective, but also from a reputation perspective, quite disastrous. However, it might not mean that we will have to end our operations. Disastrous could be a big oil spill with international media coverage. The reputational impact is quite high, but also the financial impact might be high. And some companies, if we're dealing with things like that, some governments might revoke our license to operate. And of course, this would be disastrous for our company. If we match likelihood and impact of risks, we can create the likelihood times impact matrix. And here, this is a way of mapping our risks and seeing how we can put our attention to certain events and certain risks and deal with them effectively. So if we have a very high score, like 16, something that is very likely to happen and has a severe, if not disastrous effect, we should immediately deal with that. And things that are not so likely and are not so impactful don't have a high likelihood times impact score. So the likelihood times impact score could manage our attention and be a guideline for our risk management. How much influence do we have on various areas and zones where risk events might occur? We can differentiate at least 3 different areas. The first one is a zone of control where we do have at least theoretical control over things. This includes the realm of our internal business processes. Of course, all of these processes depend on individuals that we cannot perfectly control, and negligence and errors might still occur, but this is the area where we can control and where we can exercise a huge level of control. Same is true for strategic moves. When do we want to invest? In which area? Where do we want to invest in R&D or buy companies? These are decisions that we have to take. This is the zone of control. Doesn't mean that this is a perfect world, but here we can actually do something and control things. Then we have the zone of influence, where we might exercise a limited amount of control. This might be in the area of politics, where we can influence regulators, or we can write letters to politicians. There are market forces that we also are part of. And for example, a price war is something that we might eventually be able to stop or to start, and these market forces are in our zone of influence. And there's the zone of no influence. These are the megatrends and the external events that we are completely exposed to. If a pandemic occurs, if something is happening like a natural disaster, we are just at the receiving ends of the events that happen. So if you want to understand where we want to act, have a look whether you have influence or not on the particular event. So let's map our risks and opportunities together with an influence dimension. Three-dimensional risk mapping can be performed by using not only the risks and the allocation on likelihood and impact, but we also draw the size of the bubble, and the bigger the size, that means the more control we exert on the particular risk. So for example, we have the market decline as something where we have a very, very little influence on it, but we have the project management, especially the problem that our project manager cannot be replaced by somebody else, is something that is in our control, where we can do things. Let's talk about the opportunity. Maybe we just take a different color and create a fourth dimension which changes from risk to opportunity. Maybe personnel can be an opportunity that we also map here. And from a classical risk map, we get to a risk and opportunity map and see what is happening, what could be our strategic responses to the situation at hand. So, risk handling choices. Now that we know what's happening, we can think about what to do with certain risks. For example, there might be activities that we don't want to pursue. For example, providing payment options for loot boxes in online games. There might be huge reputational and even legal risk, and therefore we decide actively as a bank, for example, not to provide these options. There might be transfers necessary. So for example, we transfer our part of the risks when we have a joint venture, or we transfer part of the risks to a insurance company if we insure for certain events to happen. Transfer is fine, but of course there usually comes a huge price for transferring risks. The insurance company takes a huge part of the profit, and the transfer of power to a joint venture partner is also and equally problematic. Another option would be just to simply accept things. For example, big companies usually don't pay for for rented cars, they don't pay the risk insurance because they say, oh, if something happens, we are big enough, we can pay even for risks ourselves, which is an option. Also, based on your risk appetite, you might decide to accept quite a lot. You might accept that there are some operations that, yes, are risky. You can do what you can, but maybe it won't work out. So acceptance is, at least it's a conscious choice that you will accept it as it is. However, you could, of course, start exercising controls on certain areas and try to protect yourself from the negative consequences of an effect. You might build in redundancies. You might build in particular control mechanisms. You might, for example, hire people just to make sure that nobody can enter a certain area, or you increase the surveillance, and so on and so on. Control usually comes at a cost, but it is much more relevant, and in some areas where you want to make sure that things do not happen, this is probably the only option. And it leads us to the realm of internal controls. Internal controls. And how do you control your daily behavior and your reality? This is a huge topic. Preventing risk to materialize can be done in various ways. The beginning of everything is the control consciousness. If you're conscious or have gained consciousness that control is necessary to prevent things from happening and to be responsible as a leader or performance manager, that will lead you to implement certain controls. And these controls can be preventive or detective. So preventive controls are there to make sure something that could go wrong cannot go wrong. For example, somebody's entering a room that this person should not be in. So you lock the door and you physically lock that door so that person cannot come in. A burglar, somebody who wants to steal things, should be hindered by it by preventive control. This can be a fence, this can be security, and so on and so on. Detective controls are there to find out, okay, once this problem occurred, how can we detect it and eventually afterwards solve the issue. So the detective finds out something went wrong. There might be surveillance cameras, all of that. And we try to minimize through detective controls the impact of the event. These preventive or detective controls can be automated or could be manual control activities. Automated control activities are very popular and possible in our business world. Most of the business processes depend on the ERP systems. Therefore, there are a lot of automated controls within the system. It starts with certain roles, your passwords, there's your logins, and there's of course a logbook that will show you whether what happened within the system. So you see these automated controls can be quite important. Manual controls for certain areas are still important. So a security service could theoretically be automated, but we don't want a robot taking care of the security. So there are some areas where it makes sense, also if it's a one-off event, to manually control, and in other areas it's much more interesting to automate control and make sure that things cannot go wrong. So let's talk about internal controls examples. The companies are full of internal processes, and most of these processes require internal controls. In the past, most of these controls were manual, and we've seen the automation going through all domains. So let's look at the first one, which is the creditworthiness of customers that is checked by finance and accounting and not by the sales manager. That's an automated preventive control that should ensure that we're not selling too many products to one customer and that we do not get into a credit risk here. And yes, it's automated. In many cases, it's automated and it is preventive. Effective planning and budgeting processes are manual and preventive control mechanisms. There's now predictive analytics that can, to a certain extent, automate these preventive controls, but it's still classically a preventive control. If we talk about purchasing limits and the limited ability of just anyone buying a Mercedes-Benz for a company, is an automated or manual preventive control, right? You need signatures, and all of these procedures are usually automated, and all the approvals are automated within the system. The comparison of reported results with plans and budgets used to be a uniquely manual and detective exercise. But in today's world, we see this also being automated. The comparison between what is and what should be is easy to be automated. And it's detective in such a way that we might eventually even find out that there was fraud happening, that things are not as planned, that there's human behavior in place. The reconciliation of inventory accounts with perpetual records, yes, important. Find out whether our accounting numbers have some link to reality, very important. Manual and detective, even today it's mostly manual and people do their inventory counts. So let's move to other tools for that. So the monthly risk list on a business unit level could be a very interesting tool to manage risk just by having a list, right? And this list of the biggest lists at hand will be presented and talked about in every management or executive team session. So in this case, we know, oh, there might be a certain machine tool that might break down and it would have a severe impact, so a high risk score, and it's getting older and older and we are waiting for the new machine to come, but we don't know, and it might take even longer. So that's a huge risk that we have to watch carefully. A Greenpeace action might actually ruin our reputation, or at least tarnish our reputation. So we believe that this is highly likely, and although we are working hard to prevent this to happen, this is something that might happen very soon. Warranty cases for certain projects are a regular risk. If they have real high numbers involved, they might be put on a risk list. A credit rating downgrade would have certain impact on the company. I might say that we don't have a lot of risks, and it might be modest. However, this is an important risk to manage. The insolvency of some customers might have impact, so their credit sales that might not materialize or where we do not get the money. These are all topics that can be put on the monthly risk list, which is a tool to keep in mind what's happening, what are the key risks that we are currently exposed to. Another way of dealing with risks would be to assign risk owners to certain problems. So, for example, if we are a big car manufacturer, we might have the problem that the potential risk there that there's an interruption of deliveries, and it will lead to a stop in production. So we develop certain key risk indicators, for example, the percentage of incoming defects. That means what's the percentage of products that we receive or materials that are not correct, that they are defect. If the status is 0.1%, we might say, still okay, and the risk measures are taken by the inbound quality controls. And Mr. Hack is responsible for all of that. Not bad. We have incorrect shipments, and these incorrect shipments are at 1.5%. That means 1.5 out of 100 shipments that we get is simply not correct. We get the wrong thing. And here again, we can do supplier audits to make sure that we increase the process quality of our suppliers. Ms. Snappy is responsible for that. Due payments paid. That's an important question. Do we pay regularly and on time? If that's not the case, we might eventually be put on hold from our suppliers. 98% is not so bad. We can measure that. We can create a payables report and manage it on a regular basis. This is also something that could be automated. Ms. Wang is responsible for that. And finally, we have the key risk indicator of purchasing lead time. Currently, we wait 35 days between ordering something and receiving it. So weekly purchasing meetings are there to take care of these purchasing lead times. We have to maintain a close contact with our suppliers in order to make sure that we maintain very good conditions and maintain good relationships with our suppliers. So the risk responsibility card would be one way of addressing particular key risk indicators and key risks to individuals. Risk governance. Governance, usually the management of management, and risk governance as a part of corporate governance is a comprehensive approach for decision-making processes associated with strategic, operational, and environmental risks in line with stakeholder expectations. Usually we define a risk strategy. What kind of risk would be acceptable? What kind of risk do we want to take? And what risks are off limit? Then we want to make sure that once we have a risk strategy, we also ensure that we are controlling it. It's good to trust our organization, to trust people to do things, but it's also important to control, and the internal audit is part of that. Yes, communication is creating trust. The communication takes place with our stakeholders, with our employees. It's an important part of the risk management approach. And finally, it'll lead to the reporting in our annual reports or in sustainability reports about the operational and strategic risks that we are facing. So a formalized reporting is part of the overall risk governance. Oh yes, and there are psychological shades of risk management. We call them biases, cognitive and political biases that occur. Risk management fails consistently in turning uncertainty into certainty. What does it mean? In a VUCA world where we cannot control things, risk management will not change the lack of full control. It will change the level of preparedness for unexpected events. Risk management is opposed to the optimistic animal spirit which drives business. Yes, it's much easier to be optimistic, to see our sales increase and our profit, and we're on track for profitable growth, and there's nobody who can stop us. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Not always the case, and risk management goes beyond or even against this optimistic and animal spirit. So it will create resistance. People who talk like that will not be advanced. They will not be promoted. The people who get promoted are mostly those who are the risk takers and the opportunity grabbers. Cognitive biases like overconfidence, that means we are too confident that we actually can control things in the future. Mental accounting, we might eventually not appreciate situations based on the real value, but on personally biased ideas. And we might apply the status quo bias. So people usually are stuck in their reality and they cannot imagine that from one day or another there will be a new competitor, a new technology, and everything will be changed. Risk management is still undervalued. I read in the 90s running a corporation without risk management is like driving a car without brakes. It's true, but it's still showing a lack of a good and productive risk management paradigm. Risk management shouldn't be just the brake. It should be part of the steering wheel, and risk management should take care of every little aspect of our business. And last but not least, do not forget that there's an opportunity in any situation. And if we prepare and actively prepare for the future, taking care of the risks, this is also a wonderful opportunity to talk about opportunities. And preparing for opportunities can pay off mightily. For example, if we know that the activities or there will be a problem in the economic cycle, and we know that and we prepare for that, we might buy our competitors cheaply, we might expand our business, and all of that because we had a plan and prepared for the worst. And that situation, whereas our other competitors are struggling to survive, we might be in the position to grab now all these competitors and buy them at a cheap price and create a series of lucky buys and reshape the structure of the industry. Risk and opportunity management. What a pleasure. Thanks for watching this teaching video. I think you should have learned that risk management should be should become part of the DNA of a company, should be part of the processes, the thinking processes, the action, the culture, and like that we frame the operational and strategic performance of a company within the realm of risks and opportunities that arise from unexpected but prepared for events. Ladies and gentlemen, hope you prepare this one for your exam and your life. Thank you.